Snow had a way of swallowing sound out here. But that February, it didn't just hush the forest. It remade it into a blank, shifting labyrinth. My cabin sat miles from the nearest county road. A small square of light buried beneath. A sky that looked forged from iron. 8 winters alone had taught me the rhythms of isolation. The moan of a distant owl, the soft percussion of powder sliding off pine boughs, the dry snap of wood settling in the stove. But when the blizzard came, those familiar cues dissolved into a single endless roar. For 3 days the wind rattled the shutters as if the mountain itself were breathing against my walls. When the storm finally loosened its grip, the stillness felt wrong, too absolute, as if the world was waiting for me to move first. I stepped outside into a silence thick enough to taste, the cold gnawing at my skin through layers of wool. 4 feet of new snow erased every boundary. Paths, trees, even the shape of the land folded into one seamless sheet of white. My breath crystallized midair and felt like crushed glass. I should have been thinking about the propane tank or the next armload of firewood. Instead, I stood listening, a dull ache in my ears from the sudden absence of wind. That's when I heard it, a thin, wavering sound that didn't belong. Not the sharp cry of a jay or the wary bark of a fox, more like the whimper of something fragile trying not to disappear. I followed it toward the tree line, each step a slow battle against drifts that swallowed me to the knees. My flashlight beam skittered across branches sheathed in ice until it landed on a small, motionless shape pressed against a pine trunk. For a breathless moment, I thought I'd found a lost child. Then the details rearranged themselves into something stranger. Long arms curled around a compact torso, dark dense hair matted with frost, a face neither human nor animal, its flat nose rimmed with ice. The creature barely moved, each shallow exhale a faint puff of vapor that clung to the air like smoke. Instinct tugged me backward. Every old story about things that shouldn't exist flickered across my mind, but another pull was stronger. Compassion, the kind that bypasses thought and makes your hands move before reason can argue. I slid the flashlight into the snow and crouched. The hair beneath my glove was stiff with cold, the skin beneath it hard as frozen leather. Whatever it was, it wouldn't survive another hour in that bitter dark. Carrying it back felt like hauling a half-frozen dream through the storm's leftovers. The weight surprised me, small but dense, as if gravity held it a little tighter. I slipped twice, once sinking so deep. I had to brace the creature across my knees while I clawed for footing. All the while I expected a sudden snap of movement. A clawed hand, a wild scream, but it lay slack in my arms, its faint heartbeat the only proof of life. Inside, I built the fire until the stove walls glowed red and wrapped, the little body in blankets that smelled of pine smoke. I set a hot water bottle against its chest and watched, for signs that heat could coax it back. For hours, nothing changed. The cabin filled with the ticking of melting ice, my own pulse loud enough to rival the storm's memory. Then, just after noon, a shiver ran through the bundle of blankets like a small earthquake. The lips, blue when I found them, softened to a dusky rose. Breath deepened, each inhale steadier than the last. It didn't open its eyes until the next morning. I was sipping coffee when a low grunt rose from the hearthside. 2 dark irises met mine, luminous and searching, as if they'd been awake the whole time, just waiting for courage. The stare wasn't animal. It was deliberate, assessing. For a heartbeat, neither of us moved. Then it tried to sit up, muscles trembling like new saplings in wind. I spoke without thinking. A soft murmur meant more for me than for it. Words don't matter when tone carries the meaning. Slowly, I offered warm water. It watched the cup, then me, then back to the cup before leaning forward to take a sip with surprising care. The steam traced faint halos around its face, and in that quiet exchange I felt the first fragile thread of trust pull tight. Days stretched into a rhythm both strange and intimate. The creature, small enough to seem childlike, yet built for a world rougher than mine, followed me with silent curiosity. It studied the crackle of the stove, the rattle of pots, even the lazy drift of smoke through sunlight. Its eyes followed every motion as though cataloging each for a language it might someday speak. Food revealed its preferences. It turned from crackers and canned beans, but brightened at fresh meat or the frozen berries I'd stored from summer. When I set a handful of blueberries on a plate, it scooped them up with a quick, delicate grace and hummed a tune so low, I felt it more than heard it, a sound like wind threading through hollow stone. Outside, winter tightened its grip. Each morning we woke to frost thick as salt on the window glass. I cut trails through the drifts while it padded behind, feet wide and sure, toes splaying like natural snowshoes. Sometimes it stopped abruptly, nostrils flaring as if reading messages hidden in the air. I caught nothing but the clean bite of pine and ice, yet its gaze lingered on distances I couldn't measure. By the second week, subtle changes crept in. Tracks larger than any I'd made pressed into the snow near the tree line. Their pattern deliberate, their presence unmistakable. At dawn, I found stones arranged in quiet spirals. Branches bent into shapes that felt intentional. Each discovery tightened a wire of unease and wonder inside me. Something was watching, something that moved when the world slept. The creature noticed too. It spent long minutes at the window, eyes scanning the forest with a concentration that made the hair on my neck prickle. Sometimes it answered the unseen with a series of low, rhythmic calls like a code carried on breath. I began to sense a conversation I could not hear. And then the gifts began. One morning, a rabbit lay on the doorstep, perfectly cleaned as though prepared by invisible hands. Another day, it was a neat bundle of berries wrapped in broad leaves. Each offering arrived without tracks leading in or away, as if the forest itself had delivered them. When I pointed to these gifts, my companion made an eager sound, a note of recognition threaded with relief. Every evening, the cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a listening post on the edge of something vast. The forest was no longer an empty sprawl of trees and snow. It was an intelligence moving just out of sight, watching not with menace but with patient curiosity. And every night, as the creature settled beside the fire and that quiet hum floated through the room, I wondered whether the storm had carried more than ice and wind to my door. The forest had always kept its secrets behind curtains of pine, but now those curtains seemed to breathe. Each morning, I woke to signs that something had passed through while I slept. Footprints wider than a man's hand pressed deep into the snow and then vanished in mid-stride, as if the earth itself had erased their path. Branches bent into curious shapes, forming patterns too deliberate to be accidents, glinted with frost like quiet symbols no human alphabet could capture. Inside the cabin, the little one grew stronger, its presence filling the small room with a quiet electricity. It no longer clung to the stove for warmth. Instead, it roamed with nimble confidence, touching the grain of the wooden walls as if reading their history through its fingertips. Sometimes it would mimic my movements, a soft echo of my gestures, tilting its head the way I did when listening for distant sounds, or tracing the rim of a cup the way I did before taking a sip. I never taught it these things. It simply watched and learned, like water memorizing the shape of its container. When we ventured outside, the creature's senses guided us. It would stop without warning, nostrils twitching at scents I couldn't detect, eyes sharpening as though catching whispers in the wind. I followed its gaze more than once, only to see the forest standing perfectly still. Yet an undercurrent in the air made my heart beat faster, like music so low it vibrated in bone instead of ear. The ground pulsed with a quiet tension, subtle as a held breath but undeniably alive. One evening I found a new offering on the porch, a cluster of wintergreen berries arranged in a spiral, around a polished stone the color of midnight water. No tracks led to it, no hint of how it arrived. The little one approached, eyes shining, and let out a series of soft calls, 3 rising tones followed by a low hum. It touched the stone with reverence before handing it to me, as if transferring a message I couldn't decode. When I placed the stone on the mantel, the creature exhaled a sound that carried relief, almost gratitude. The exchange of gifts became a rhythm, a language of its own. I left dried venison or handmade tools near the threshold. By dawn, they were replaced with herbs that smelled of rain or delicately carved wooden figures shaped like animals I'd never seen. Each trade deepened a silent pact, and the forest began to feel less like wilderness and more like a neighborhood of unseen neighbors. But the presence around us was not always gentle. On a night when the moon cut through ragged clouds, I woke to a deep vibration rolling beneath the floorboards. It wasn't thunder, too steady, too close. The little one stood at the window, eyes reflecting the moonlight like molten copper, and answered the unseen with a low, resonant call that seemed to climb the walls. Outside, the trees swayed without wind. A faint metallic hum threaded the cold air, so soft I questioned whether it lived in my ears or in the woods themselves. In the days that followed, the creature grew restless. It watched the horizon with a longing that needed no translation. Sometimes it gathered small objects, stones, twigs, bits of moss, and arranged them in careful patterns on the table, only to sweep them away with a sighing sound. At night I heard distant responses to its calls, deep, almost choral tones echoing from beyond the ridge. They weren't echoes of its own voice. They arrived with their own cadence, layered and deliberate. I began to feel like a guest in my own home, an outsider invited into a conversation older than the trees. The little one's dark eyes held questions I couldn't answer, and I sensed that my role as caretaker was approaching its inevitable end. I found myself speaking to it in low murmurs, confessing thoughts I rarely admitted even to myself, about the quiet loneliness that had driven me here, about the fragile peace I found in its company. It listened, tilting its head as if absorbing the emotion behind the words, and sometimes reached out a small hand to rest on mine, a gesture so human it tightened my throat. By the third week, the forest no longer felt merely alive. It felt attentive. I'd wake to faint rustling outside, the sound of snow being moved with deliberate care. Once, before dawn, I stepped onto the porch and glimpsed a silhouette at the edge of the trees. Tall, broad, motionless. It watched for a heartbeat that stretched like a drawn bowstring, then melted into shadow. The little one emerged beside me and made a series of soft clicks toward the darkness. A farewell or a greeting, I couldn't tell. As winter began to loosen its grip, the signs multiplied. Larger footprints circled the clearing in quiet concentric rings. Small totems of woven grass appeared at the base of pines. The little one grew more animated, answering distant calls with a voice that carried surprising power. Each sound was a note in a language my mind could almost understand but never fully grasp. I felt the invisible crowd gathering beyond sight, an assembly of eyes and minds waiting for the moment to reveal themselves. One night, as embers dimmed in the stove, the creature approached me carrying something it had crafted, a necklace braided from plant fibers, set with stones polished smooth by patient hands. It slipped the necklace over my head with a care that felt ceremonial. The stones were cool against my skin, yet they seemed to hold a quiet warmth of their own, as though carrying the memory of another's touch. The little one stepped back, its eyes reflecting the firelight, and made a soft rising sound. Approval, perhaps, or a benediction. Sleep came late that night. Through the window, the forest glowed with moonlight, every branch etched in silver. I felt the necklace's weight as a promise and a warning. Something was about to change. And when dawn finally arrived, sharp and blue, the creature was already standing at the door, listening to a call only it could hear. The day of parting began with a hush that was almost reverent. No bird calls, no creak of ice, only the faint rhythm of something vast and unseen moving beyond the tree line. Shapes shifted between the pines, tall, deliberate, impossibly graceful. The little one pressed its hand to the door and looked back at me, eyes bright with certainty. I understood without words its family had come. The morning air held a clarity that felt almost ceremonial, every shard of frost gleaming like it had been placed with intention. I stepped outside behind the little one, the cold striking my lungs with the sharpness of clean metal. Beyond the porch, the forest breathed in subtle motion, branches flexing without wind, shadows gathering and dispersing as though the trees themselves were adjusting to witness what was about to unfold. From the depths of the pines came a sound both deep and measured, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the marrow of the land. The little one answered with a call of its own. 3 notes, low and rising, a melody so precise it felt older than language. Figures began to emerge between the trunks, massive silhouettes, deliberate in every step. They carried the gravity of mountains and the quiet of snowfall. Their presence both awe-inspiring and strangely gentle. I counted 3 of them, each taller than any person I'd ever seen. Their hair shimmered with a sheen of frost, catching stray spears of sunlight until they appeared haloed in silver. They moved with a grace that defied their size, not so much walking as flowing from shadow to shadow. One, broader than the rest, paused a few yards away and met my eyes. Its gaze held the weight of centuries, neither predator nor prey, but something apart, something vast. The little one rushed forward with a burst of sound that rang like joy itself. A pair of enormous arms swept it into a slow, deliberate embrace. A reunion so tender it made the cold feel distant. The other adults lingered behind, watching with expressions I couldn't name yet somehow understood. Relief, recognition. the quiet triumph of something once lost now found. I remained still, the snow creaking beneath my boots as I tried to steady my breath. The largest figure stepped closer until the distance between us narrowed to a handful of feet. It studied me with an intelligence that made words feel inadequate. From a pouch at its side, it drew a bundle wrapped in leaves and placed it carefully on the snow between us. Inside, I found carved stones traced with intricate spirals, dried herbs that released a fragrance like warm rain on earth, and a strip of smoked meat darker than cedar bark, an offering unmistakably deliberate. I lifted my gaze to meet the creature's eyes. They were dark pools with a shimmer of light deep inside, reflecting something that felt like gratitude. It made a single sound, low, resonant, and astonishingly clear. Then, with a careful precision that startled me, it formed an English word shaped by a heavy, unfamiliar accent. Good! The word lingered in the cold air, heavy as a promise. My throat tightened. I nodded and managed to return the same word, my own voice barely a whisper. The meaning stretched far beyond its syllable. Trust, thanks. A recognition of shared life beneath different skins. The goodbye unfolded without haste. The little one padded toward me once more, eyes bright with a complicated mix of excitement and something like sorrow. It reached for the necklace it had given me, tapped the stones gently, then touched its own chest, a gesture of connection that needed no translation. I knelt and it pressed its forehead lightly against mine, a quiet farewell that felt older than speech. The adults waited, patient and unhurried. When the little one finally joined them, they turned as a group and moved back into the forest. Their passage was nearly soundless, a choreography of immense bodies dissolving into trees. In moments, the woods returned to stillness, leaving only a scatter of giant footprints and the faint scent of pine and something more elusive, like rain mixed with iron and distant smoke. I stood for a long time, the necklace warm against my skin, until the shapes and sounds of the forest settled back into their ordinary rhythm. When I returned to the cabin, the silence felt different. It wasn't empty. It carried an unseen presence, as though the forest had acknowledged me as more than a passerby. Days turned to weeks, and the quiet arrangement between us continued in a new form. Gifts began to appear without warning, a haunch of venison hanging from a branch, a bundle of herbs tied with woven grass, a finely carved tool left neatly by the porch. Each offering bore the same careful craftsmanship, as if to remind me that the bond forged in winter had not dissolved with the snow. I left my own small tokens in return: dried fruit, handmade tools, jars of honey. They always disappeared by morning. Sometimes I woke to find paths cleared after a storm or fresh water, left in wooden vessels when I was ill. Their watchfulness was subtle yet unmistakable, like a hand resting lightly on my shoulder just out of sight. As season shifted, I caught glimpses of the little one, now taller, stronger, moving with the ease of a creature entirely at home. Once at dusk, I saw it pause in a clearing and lift an arm in a gesture both playful and profound, a wave that bridged the distance between our worlds. I raised my own hand in silent reply, the forest carrying our unspoken exchange like a secret it intended to keep. Life has changed in ways I could never have predicted when that blizzard first pinned me inside. I came to these woods to escape people and their noise. Instead, I discovered a community beyond anything I imagined, a quiet fellowship built on mutual respect, wordless understanding, and a shared stewardship of this wild, breathing earth. I am no longer simply a solitary man in a cabin. I am a neighbor, watched over and in turn watching with care. The necklace remains against my chest, its stones warmed by body and memory. Sometimes when the night is still, I feel the faintest vibration through it, like a heartbeat echoing from somewhere deep in the forest. And I know that the bond forged on that frozen morning endures, a connection carved in snow and silence, as real as the towering pines and as enduring as the stars that wheel above them. As season shifted, I caught glimpses of the little one, now taller, stronger, moving with the ease of a creature entirely at home. Once at dusk, I saw it pause in a clearing and lift an arm in a gesture both playful and profound, a wave that bridged the distance between our worlds. I raised my own hand in silent reply, the forest carrying our unspoken exchange like a secret it intended to keep. Life has changed in ways I could never have predicted when that blizzard first pinned me inside. I came to these woods to escape people and their noise. Instead, I discovered a community beyond anything I imagined, a quiet fellowship built on mutual respect, wordless understanding, and a shared stewardship of this wild, breathing earth. I am no longer simply a solitary man in a cabin. I am a neighbor, watched over and in turn watching with care. The necklace remains against my chest, its stones warmed by body and memory. Sometimes when the night is still, I feel the faintest vibration through it, like a heartbeat echoing from somewhere deep in the forest. And I know that the bond forged on that frozen morning endures, a connection carved in snow and silence, as real as the towering pines and as enduring as the stars that wheel above them. Life in the cabin grew easier, yet more profound. I no longer hunted as much. Meat appeared when needed, cleanly dressed and hung with silent efficiency. Storm-fallen trees were cleared from the path to my well before I could lift an axe. When illness found me one bitter winter, fresh water and herbs arrived each morning until I recovered. These acts carried no demand, no claim, only an unspoken covenant of care. I never sought their home, never tried to capture a photograph or a footprint. Some truths are kept not by secrecy but by mutual choice. What we shared was not a discovery to broadcast. It was a relationship to protect. In the hush of early mornings, with frost threading the windows and the necklace warm against my skin, I often sensed them near, a quiet presence just beyond the trees, watching, perhaps even listening but never intruding. The forest itself began to teach me subtle lessons. I noticed how the wind bends through valleys before a storm, how deer shift their feeding grounds days before weather breaks, how moss angles to hidden water sources. It was as if the land, seeing me accepted by its oldest inhabitants, decided to speak in its own slow language, and at last I was able to hear. Years have slipped by since that first blizzard night, yet the memory of carrying a fragile, frostbitten being through a storm remains as vivid as the sting of cold on my cheeks. I went into that storm a solitary man seeking quiet. I remain a solitary man, but no longer alone. My neighbors are shadows in the trees, my companions in silence, my teachers in patience and respect. We are bound by something that has no need for words, a trust forged in snow and kept alive in the quiet pulse of the wilderness. Winter returned with a gentler hand the following year, draping the valley in a hush that felt almost like a blessing. Snow fell in slow spirals, each flake carrying a faint glint of starlight, and the forest seemed to breathe in a deeper rhythm, as though it recognized the cycle and welcomed it. I had grown used to this quiet dialogue between myself and the unseen, an exchange of presence more profound than words. The gifts continued, but their nature shifted. Where once I found bundles of food or hand-carved tools, I now discovered objects that seemed to carry stories. A strip of bark etched with interlocking patterns like a map of rivers I'd never crossed. A stone polished to a mirror sheen that reflected not only my face but the forest behind me, as if both of us belonged to the same image. These offerings felt less like provisions and more like invitations to perceive a deeper order. One late evening, as embers glowed low in the stove, a sound drifted through the trees, low, melodic, and layered, like wind passing through a dozen hollow reeds. I stepped outside and let the cold bite into my lungs. There was no movement beyond the dark, yet the melody wound through the night with slow intention, filling the space between heartbeats. I knew it wasn't meant to summon me. It was a conversation carried across miles, one I was simply allowed to overhear. Days blended into weeks. My cabin life remained simple, splitting wood, mending tools, tending the small garden that slept beneath the snow, but everything I did felt threaded with an unseen companionship. At dawn, I often found faint impressions in the drifts near my porch, wide arcs, as if something massive had stood there for a moment before stepping back into the forest. Not a challenge, not a threat, just a silent acknowledgement that I was remembered. On a rare trip to the nearest town for supplies, people asked the usual questions. Did I ever get lonely? Had I seen anything strange out there? I only smiled and said the woods were good company. How could I explain that I was no longer simply a man living in isolation, but part of a quiet, ancient network of care? To speak it aloud would feel like betrayal, as if language might fracture the fragile trust that had been freely given. The little one, no longer little, appeared again the following spring. I was gathering kindling when I sensed a presence and looked up to find it standing across the clearing. Taller now, shoulders broad, eyes alight with recognition. It stepped forward just enough for the sunlight to catch the familiar necklace around my neck. With a slow, deliberate motion, it lifted a hand, palm outward. A greeting, a remembrance, a promise. I raised my own hand, feeling the weight of seasons settle into that single gesture. No words passed between us. None were needed. After a long moment, it turned and slipped back into the trees, leaving only the faint sway of branches to mark its path. I stayed there until the shadows stretched long, the forest holding a quiet warmth that had nothing to do with the sun. Years may continue to turn, storms may come and go, but the bond forged on that frozen morning endures like a heartbeat beneath the soil. I have no desire to prove what happened. Some truths are too intimate for proof. They live in the silent accord between beings who recognize each other not through speech or evidence, but through an unspoken vow of respect. Now, when night settles and the stove ticks softly, I sometimes catch the low cadence of distant calls woven into the wind. They rise and fall like the breathing of the earth itself, steady and eternal, and every time I touch the necklace at my chest, a quiet acknowledgement of the family who found me as surely as I found them, a reminder that even in the deepest solitude, we are never truly alone.